You stand at the edge of a lake in the early morning, mist rising from still water like breath made visible. The surface reflects nothing yet too dim for clarity, too early for the sun to burn away the mystery. This is where all deep inquiries begin. In the liminal space between sleeping and waking, between knowing and unknowing, between the conscious mind that organizes your day and the vast unconscious that shapes your dreams. Carl Jung stood at such edges his entire life. As a young psychiatrist in the early 1900s, he peered into the minds of patients whom society had dismissed as hopelessly mad, and discovered not chaos but pattern, not meaningless rambling, but mythic narratives playing out in modern dress. The schizophrenic woman who believed herself pursued by demons, Jung realized enacting the same archetypal drama that had been told around fires for millennia. The businessman who descended into paralyzing depression was walking the same underworld journey that Persephone had traveled, that Dante had mapped, that every hero in every myth had been forced to navigate. You have come here, perhaps, for something quieter, something to ease the restless mind as it prepares for sleep. But Jung's psychology has a way of whispering beneath even the calmest surfaces. It suggests that what we call self is far more complex, far more mysterious, and far more dangerous than we dare admit. The persona you wear to work, the shadow you cast but refuse to see, the dreams that visit you unbidden, all of these are not accidents of consciousness, but fundamental architectures of the human psyche. Modern neuroscience has begun to validate what Jung intuited through decades of careful observation. The brain operates on multiple levels simultaneously, processing information far below the threshold of awareness, making connections across vast networks of association, constructing narratives that give meaning to the chaos of experience. What Jung called the collective unconscious, contemporary researchers recognize as the shared neural pattern that emerged from our common evolutionary heritage. What he termed archetypes, we now understand as universal cognitive structures that shape perception, emotion, and behavior across all cultures. But Jung was not merely a researcher cataloguing psychological phenomena. He was a guide for those willing to undertake what he called the most difficult journey any human can attempt, the journey toward wholeness. This path, individuation, requires nothing less than a complete reckoning with everything you have been taught to deny about yourself. It demands that you face not only your personal shadows, but the collective shadows of your culture, your family, your species. It asks you to recognize that the very traits you despise in others may be the disowned parts of yourself projected outward because you lack the courage to claim them. Tonight, as you settle into whatever form of rest awaits you, consider this. The landscape of your inner life is far vaster than you imagine. Your conscious mind, that chattering voice that plans and judges and remembers occupies perhaps 10% of your psychological territory. The remaining 90% lies in darkness, shaped by forces you have never consciously encountered, but which influence every choice you make, every relationship you form, every dream that visits you in sleep. You wake each morning and, without thinking, begin the process of becoming someone the world can tolerate. You select clothes that communicate the right message. You arrange your face into expressions that invite neither too much intimacy nor too much distance. You modulate your voice to strike the precise balance between confidence and humility that your particular role demands. This is not deception. This is survival. Jung called this constructed self the persona, borrowing the term from ancient Greek theatre, where actors wore masks to project their characters across vast amphitheatres. Your persona serves the same function. It amplifies certain qualities while concealing others, creating a coherent public self from the contradictory chaos of your inner experience. The competent professional, the nurturing parent, the reliable friend, each represents a different mask, a different way of organizing your complexity into something others can understand and accept. The persona emerges from necessity. Human societies could not function if we revealed our complete, unfiltered selves to everyone we encounter. Imagine a world where every person spoke every thought, expressed every emotion, acted on every impulse. The result would not be authenticity, but chaos. The supermarket checkout would become a confessional. The office meeting would dissolve into primal drama. Social bonds would shatter under the weight of unmediated truth. So we learn from our earliest years to curate ourselves. The child discovers that certain behaviors earn approval while others provoke disapproval. Gradually, through countless small adjustments, the persona crystallizes around what works, what keeps you safe, valued, included in the tribe that ensures your survival. This process happens largely below conscious awareness. You do not sit down at age 5 and deliberately construct a personality. Instead, you respond to feedback loops so subtle and persistent that they shape you like water shapes stone, slowly, invisibly, irrevocably. But Jung observed something troubling in his patients, particularly those who sought his help in midlife. Many had become extraordinarily successful at maintaining their personas. They were admired colleagues, devoted spouses, respected community members. Yet they came to him with a profound sense of emptiness, as if they were living someone else's life. They had worn their masks so consistently for so long that they could no longer remember what lay beneath. I feel like an actor who has forgotten he is acting, one patient told Jung. I know my lines perfectly. I hit my marks. The audience applauds, but I cannot find myself anywhere in the performance. This is the shadow side of the persona. It can become so convincing, so seamlessly integrated into daily life that it ceases to feel like a role and begins to feel like reality. The danger is not that you wear masks, the danger is that you forget you are wearing them. When the persona hardens into rigid identity, it cuts you off from the vast reservoir of potential that exists within your unconscious mind. You become a character in search of an author, a performance without a performer. Jung documented this phenomenon across countless case studies. The businessman who had crafted himself into a model of efficiency found that he could no longer access creativity or spontaneity. The mother who had perfected the role of selfless nurturer discovered she had lost touch with her own desires and ambitions. The social activist who had built an identity around moral righteousness realized he could not tolerate complexity or nuance in himself or others. In each case, the persona that had once served as a bridge between inner and outer worlds had become a prison. The mask that had protected the vulnerable self had grown so thick that it suffocated the life beneath. These individuals had achieved what society calls success, but at the cost of psychological wholeness. Contemporary culture presents unique challenges to maintaining a flexible relationship with the persona. Social media platforms encourage the curation of identity to an unprecedented degree. You can craft different versions of yourself for different audiences. The professional persona on LinkedIn, the social persona on Instagram, the intellectual persona on Twitter, the personal persona on Facebook. Each platform rewards certain qualities: success, beauty, cleverness, authenticity, while punishing others. The result is not liberation, but multiplication of masks. Where previous generations might have worn one primary persona in their community, you now juggle dozens, each requiring maintenance, each demanding consistency, each threatening exposure if the performance falters. The constant pressure to present a curated self can lead to what researchers now term authenticity fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from perpetual self-monitoring and impression management. Moreover, the speed of modern communication means that persona management has become a full-time occupation. Every text message, every email, every casual conversation requires micro-adjustments to your presentation. The executive learns to modulate her assertiveness differently with subordinates, peers, and superiors. The parent shifts seamlessly between the authority figure with children and the diplomatic partner with other adults. The teenager navigates the complex social hierarchies of school, family, and peer groups, each demanding a different version of selfhood. Jung would not have been surprised by these developments. He predicted that as societies became more complex and interconnected, the pressure to develop sophisticated personas would intensify. He also warned that this pressure would make it increasingly difficult for individuals to maintain contact with their authentic selves, the complex, contradictory, unconscious forces that constitute their deeper nature. One of Jung's most crucial insights concerned what happens to the qualities that the persona must exclude. If you build your public identity around being agreeable and accommodating, what becomes of your natural aggression and self-assertion? If you craft yourself into a model of rational control, where does your emotional spontaneity go? If you perfect the role of the strong, independent individual, what happens to your needs for dependency and support? These excluded qualities do not simply vanish. According to Jung's theory of psychological compensation, they accumulate in the unconscious, where they form what he called the shadow, everything you are but cannot admit to being. The more rigid and one-sided the persona becomes, the more powerful and autonomous the shadow grows. This dynamic creates internal tension that manifests in various ways. Some individuals experience it as a vague sense of dissatisfaction or restlessness, a feeling that something important is missing from their lives despite external success. Others encounter their shadow through projection. They become intensely irritated by people who exhibit the very qualities they have disowned in themselves. Still others meet their shadow in dreams, where repressed aspects of personality emerge in disguised form. Jung observed that the shadow often appears in dreams as a figure of the same gender as the dreamer, but possessing opposite qualities. The mild-mannered clerk dreams of a violent criminal. The rigid perfectionist dreams of a chaotic rebel. The selfless caregiver dreams of a ruthless narcissist. These shadow figures are not enemies to be defeated, but lost parts of the self seeking integration. In some cases, the tension between persona and shadow becomes so extreme that it erupts into consciousness dramatically. The respected minister is caught in a sexual scandal. The devoted family man abandons his responsibilities to pursue a fantasy of freedom. The gentle caregiver explodes in rage. These breakdowns, while destructive, often represent the psyche's desperate attempt to restore balance. Jung did not advocate for the abandonment of the persona. He understood its necessity for social functioning and psychological development. Instead, he emphasized the importance of maintaining what he called persona flexibility, the ability to wear your masks consciously, to adjust your presentation according to context, while remembering that no single role captures your complete identity. Healthy individuals develop what Jung termed a persona wardrobe, a collection of social roles that they can assume and discard as circumstances require. They can be the authoritative leader in a business meeting and the vulnerable friend in an intimate conversation. They can present themselves as competent and self-sufficient when the situation demands it, and reveal their uncertainties and needs when safety allows. The key is consciousness. When you know you are wearing a mask, you maintain the freedom to remove it. When you remember that your public role is a tool rather than your identity, you preserve access to the full range of your psychological potential. This awareness requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing tendencies in consciousness simultaneously without immediately resolving the tension. Consider the difference between two individuals facing a professional crisis. The first has identified completely with her role as a successful executive. When the crisis threatens her position, she experiences it as an attack on her fundamental identity. She cannot imagine herself as anything other than successful. So she becomes desperate, potentially destructive, in her attempts to preserve her image. The second individual maintains conscious relationship with her executive persona. She values her professional role and works to protect it, but she also knows that her identity encompasses much more than her job title. When crisis strikes, she can draw on resources that exist outside her professional self: creativity, resilience, adaptability, relationships that help her navigate the challenge with greater wisdom and less desperation. Jung's analysis extended beyond individual psychology to examine how entire cultures develop collective personas. Just as individuals craft public identities that emphasize certain qualities while hiding others, societies create mythologies about themselves that highlight their virtues while obscuring their shadows. The American persona, for example, emphasizes individual freedom, innovation, and opportunity while downplaying the violence and exploitation that enabled westward expansion. The German persona Jung emphasized order, efficiency, and cultural achievement while repressing acknowledgement of authoritarian tendencies. The British persona celebrated rationality, fair play, and civilized discourse while avoiding recognition of imperial brutality. These cultural personas serve important functions. They provide social cohesion, inspire collective action, and offer individuals meaningful roles within a larger narrative. But like individual personas, they become dangerous when they harden into rigid ideologies that cannot tolerate complexity or contradiction. Jung lived through the rise of fascism and witnessed how collective personas could be manipulated by those who understood their psychological power. Totalitarian movements succeed not by creating entirely new identities, but by exploiting existing cultural personas, amplifying their most extreme expressions, while ruthlessly suppressing inequalities that complicate the narrative. The antidote to collective possession, Jung argued, is the same as the antidote to individual inflation, consciousness. Societies need individuals who can step outside dominant cultural narratives and recognize them as constructions rather than ultimate truths. This requires enormous courage, as it often means accepting social marginalization and facing accusations of disloyalty or betrayal. Dreams provide unique insight into the relationship between persona and shadow because they emerge from the unconscious without conscious editing. In dreams, the carefully constructed public self often appears as a foreign character, someone you observe rather than someone you are. Meanwhile, qualities you have excluded from your waking identity may appear as central figures in the dream narrative. Jung encouraged his patients to pay particular attention to dreams where they appeared as someone completely different from their waking selves. A timid person dreams of being bold and confrontational. An intellectual dreams of being purely emotional and instinctual. An independent person dreams of being dependent and needy. These dreams often compensate for the one-sidedness of the conscious personality, offering glimpses of excluded potentials. Sometimes the persona appears in dreams as clothing that doesn't fit properly, a uniform that's too tight, a costume that keeps falling off, shoes that don't allow comfortable walking. These images suggest that the dreamer's current persona may be constraining their psychological development or may not authentically reflect their deeper nature. Other times, dreams present scenarios where the persona fails or becomes inappropriate. The professional finds herself naked in a business meeting. The parent cannot control their children in public. The religious person commits acts of shocking transgression. Rather than anxiety dreams to be dismissed, these often represent the psyche's attempt to expand beyond limiting identification. Jung developed active imagination techniques to help patients dialogue with persona figures in their dreams. By engaging these characters in conscious conversation, individuals could better understand how their public selves were functioning and what aspects of their nature were being suppressed in service of social adaptation. Intimate relationships present particular challenges to persona maintenance. The closer someone gets to you, the more difficult it becomes to sustain a consistently curated presentation. This is why many people feel more anxious about long-term relationships than casual encounters. Intimacy threatens the stability of the persona by exposing its constructed nature. Jung observed that many relationship difficulties stem from conflicts between different aspects of each person's persona wardrobe. The version of yourself that your partner first encountered may differ significantly from the version that emerges in daily domestic life. The charming, attentive suitor transforms into the preoccupied, stressed spouse. The independent, self-sufficient individual reveals needs for support and reassurance. These transitions are normal and healthy, but they can create confusion and disappointment if both parties are not prepared for them. Many couples unconsciously conspire to maintain each other's personas, avoiding topics or behaviors that might threaten their partner's carefully constructed identity. This creates relationships that are stable but superficial, intimate but not authentic. The alternative requires what Jung called mutual shadow work, the willingness of both partners to recognize and accept the full complexity of each other's nature. This means loving not just the qualities that first attracted you, but also the denied aspects that emerge over time. It means supporting your partner's growth even when it requires them to outgrow certain roles that you found comforting or convenient. Such relationships become laboratories for individuation, spaces where both people can experiment with aspects of themselves that their public personas might not accommodate. The professionally driven individual can explore dependency and vulnerability. The eternally nurturing person can discover healthy selfishness. The rational analyst can access emotional intelligence. Contemporary culture's obsession with achievement and optimization creates particular challenges for healthy persona development. The pressure to maximize every aspect of performance, professional, physical, social, even spiritual, can lead to personas that are incredibly sophisticated, but also incredibly rigid. The successful person persona demands constant vigilance. Every failure must be hidden or reframed as a learning opportunity. Every weakness must be overcome, or at least disguised. Every emotion must be managed and channeled toward productive ends. The result is often individuals who appear to have mastered life, but who live in constant fear of exposure. Jung would have recognized this as a form of inflation, the ego identifying with archetypal energies of perfection and omnipotence. The successful person begins to believe that they actually are the persona they have constructed. They lose touch with their human limitations, their need for help, their capacity for failure and redemption. The shadow of this success persona often manifests as intense judgment of others who appear weak, unsuccessful, or out of control. The perfectly disciplined individual becomes intolerant of those who struggle with addiction. The professionally accomplished person dismisses those who choose different paths. The emotionally regulated individual feels contempt for those who express their feelings openly. This judgment is actually projection. The successful person cannot tolerate seeing their own disowned qualities reflected in others. Their harsh criticism of external failure is a defense against acknowledging their own vulnerability and imperfection. The path toward what Jung called individuation requires a gradual dismantling of rigid persona identification. This does not mean abandoning social roles or becoming inappropriately self-revealing in every context. Instead, it means developing what he termed conscious participation in your various personas while maintaining connection to the deeper self that exists beyond any particular role. This process often begins with what Jung called the night-sea journey, a period of confusion, depression, or crisis that forces you to question the identities you have constructed. The successful executive faces a career setback that reveals the fragility of professional identity. The devoted parent watches children leave home and must rediscover who they are beyond the parenting role. The physically healthy person encounters illness and must grapple with vulnerability and mortality. These experiences are painful but potentially transformative. They create gaps in the persona's armor through which authentic selfhood can emerge. The key is to resist the temptation to immediately construct a new, improved persona. Instead, Jung encouraged people to sit with the uncertainty, to explore what lies beneath the masks they have worn. This exploration often reveals surprising discoveries. Qualities you believed were fundamental to your nature may turn out to be learned responses to early conditioning. Aspects of yourself you thought were weaknesses may contain seeds of previously unknown strength. Parts of your personality you judged as unacceptable may prove to be sources of creativity, passion, and vitality. The goal is not to eliminate the persona, but to restore balance between conscious presentation and unconscious authenticity. You learn to wear your masks more lightly, to choose your roles more deliberately, and to remain in dialogue with the parts of yourself that no single role can contain. You encounter someone at a social gathering who immediately irritates you. Everything about them seems designed to provoke annoyance. Their loud voice, their obvious attempts to dominate conversations, their need to be the center of attention. You find yourself making mental notes of their flaws, cataloging evidence of their narcissism and social incompetence. Later, describing them to a friend, you speak with surprising vehemence about this person you barely know. What you may not recognize is that you have just experienced one of the most powerful and dangerous mechanisms of the unconscious mind, projection. The qualities that triggered such strong emotional reactions likely exist within your own psyche, but they have been so thoroughly banished from consciousness that you can only perceive them when they appear to be embodied by someone else. Jung discovered that the human psyche cannot simply eliminate unwanted aspects of personality. Energy is conserved in psychological systems just as it is in physical ones. When you refuse to acknowledge certain tendencies within yourself, aggression, neediness, sexuality, grandiosity, vulnerability, that energy must go somewhere. It does not disappear, it gets redirected outward, causing you to perceive these denied qualities as belonging to other people. This process happens entirely below conscious awareness. You do not deliberately choose to project your disowned aggression onto your irritating colleague or your repressed neediness onto your demanding friend. The unconscious mind makes these attributions automatically, presenting them to consciousness as objective perceptions of external reality. You genuinely believe that you are simply observing other people's character flaws rather than encountering reflections of your own hidden nature. The emotional intensity that accompanies projection provides its own evidence. When someone's behavior triggers disproportionate reactions, when you find yourself thinking obsessively about their character, feeling compelled to discuss their flaws with others, experiencing physical tension in their presence, you are likely encountering your own shadow cast onto another person. To understand projection, you must first understand how the shadow forms. From your earliest years, you receive countless messages about which aspects of human nature are acceptable and which must be hidden. These messages come not only through explicit instruction, but through the subtle rewards and punishments that shape all human learning. The child who expresses anger is told to calm down or be nice. The one who shows fear is encouraged to be brave. The one who displays selfishness is taught to share and think of others. Gradually, through thousands of such interactions, you learn which parts of your natural, emotional, and behavioral repertoire earn approval and which provoke disapproval. This process is necessary for socialization, but it comes at a psychological cost. The denied aspects of personality do not disappear. They form what Jung called the personal shadow, a repository of everything you are but cannot admit to being. The shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive potentials that were discouraged by your particular family or culture. In families that value intellectual achievement, emotional intelligence may be relegated to the shadow. In cultures that prize self-reliance, interdependence and vulnerability get pushed into darkness. In communities that emphasize conformity, creativity and individuality become shadow qualities. The shadow is not simply a collection of bad traits. It is everything your conscious personality must exclude to maintain social acceptability. As you develop through childhood and adolescence, the shadow becomes increasingly autonomous. It begins to operate as a separate psychological system with its own goals, methods, and even its own intelligence. This is why you sometimes find yourself acting in ways that surprise and dismay you. The shadow can briefly break through conscious control and express itself directly. More commonly, however, the shadow expresses itself through projection. Rather than experiencing your own aggression, you perceive others as hostile. Rather than acknowledging your own manipulation, you see deception everywhere. Rather than owning your own grandiosity, you criticize others for their arrogance. Projection operates according to psychological principles that Jung mapped with scientific precision. The process requires three elements: a projector, a projection carrier, and a hook, some actual quality in the other person that can carry the projected content. The hook is crucial. You cannot project your shadow onto just anyone. The other person must possess some trace of the quality you are denying in yourself. This is what makes projection so confusing and difficult to recognize. the irritating person at the party probably does have some narcissistic tendencies. Your demanding friend likely does have unmet emotional needs. But the intensity of your reaction reveals that you are seeing not just their qualities, but your own reflected back at you. Jung observed that projection tends to be strongest between people of similar backgrounds, ages, or life circumstances, those who are most likely to share comparable psychological structures. You are less likely to project your denied materialism onto someone living in poverty than onto someone whose lifestyle resembles your own. The projection requires enough similarity to make the attribution plausible. The emotional charge that accompanies projection also follows predictable patterns. The stronger your conscious identification with being good, rational, or self-controlled, the more intense your reactions will be to people who appear bad, emotional, or impulsive. The rigid moralist is tormented by encounters with moral ambiguity. The professional who prides herself on emotional control becomes agitated around people who express feelings openly. This dynamic creates what Jung called the attraction of opposites, a compulsive fascination with people who embody qualities you have disowned. You may find yourself drawn to individuals whose behavior simultaneously appalls and intrigues you. The responsible person becomes obsessed with rebels. The conventional individual is fascinated by eccentrics. The self-sufficient person is magnetized by those who openly express neediness. Romantic relationships provide ideal laboratories for observing projection because intimate partnerships inevitably expose the shadow. The person you fall in love with often carries powerful projections. They appear to embody everything you feel is missing from your own life. The careful, controlled individual falls for someone spontaneous and passionate. The emotionally expressive person is attracted to someone who seems mysterious and self-contained. During the initial phases of romantic attachment, these projections create intense attraction and the feeling of completion. Your partner appears to possess the very qualities that would make you whole. You experience what Jung called projection euphoria, the intoxicating sense that you have found your missing half. But projection is inherently unstable. As you get to know your partner more deeply, the gap between your projections and their actual personality becomes impossible to ignore. The spontaneous person reveals themselves to be sometimes reckless and irresponsible. The mysterious person turns out to be simply withholding and uncommunicative. The projected qualities begin to feel threatening rather than attractive. This is when projection often shifts into its negative form. The same qualities that initially drew you to your partner now become sources of irritation and conflict. You may find yourself trying to change them, to eliminate the very traits that originally attracted you. What you are actually trying to do is manage your own disowned shadow by controlling its external manifestation. Many relationships cycle repeatedly through positive and negative projection without either partner recognizing the dynamic. They experience alternating periods of intense attraction and bitter disappointment, attributing these fluctuations to their partner's inconsistency rather than to their own psychological processes. The resolution requires what Jung called taking back your projections, recognizing that the qualities you see so clearly in your partner exist within yourself as well. This does not mean that your observations about them are wrong, but rather that your emotional reactions reveal as much about your own psychology as they do about theirs. Jung witnessed the most destructive potential of projection during his lifetime's encounters with fascism and war. He observed how entire societies could become possessed by collective projections, attributing all evil to designated scapegoat groups while maintaining illusions of their own innocence and righteousness. The mechanisms are identical to individual projection, but amplified through mass psychology. A culture that cannot acknowledge its own capacity for violence projects that quality onto other nations or ethnic groups. A society that refuses to face its own materialism and greed identifies these traits in minority populations or foreign powers. A community that denies its own sexual anxieties and repressions focuses obsessively on policing the sexuality of others. These collective projections become extremely dangerous because they mobilize archetypal energies that exist beyond individual consciousness. When an entire population becomes convinced that their problems stem from external enemies rather than internal contradictions, the result is often persecution, violence, and war. Jung noted that collective projections are particularly seductive because they offer simple solutions to complex problems. Rather than engaging in the difficult work of examining cultural shadows, societies can blame their difficulties on others. This provides temporary psychological relief, but ultimately makes the shadow more powerful by feeding it with additional energy and attention. The antidote to collective projection is the same as the remedy for individual projection, consciousness. Societies need individuals who can recognize cultural shadows and resist the temptation to project them outward. This requires extraordinary moral courage, as it often means standing against popular opinion and accepting social isolation. Contemporary digital culture has created new platforms for projection that would have fascinated and alarmed Jung. Social media environments encourage the rapid formation of intense judgments about people we know only through carefully curated presentation. The gap between online personas and actual personalities creates ideal conditions for projection to flourish. The anonymity and distance provided by digital communication also lower the barriers to projective attacks. People say things to others online that they would never say in face-to-face encounters, often with a viciousness that reveals the power of unconscious shadow material seeking expression. Comment sections, discussion forums, and social media platforms become theaters where collective projections play out in real time. Political opponents are demonized not just for their policies, but for their character. Cultural conflicts become opportunities for mass projection, with each side attributing all virtue to itself and all vice to its enemies. The speed and scale of digital communication mean that projective dynamics that once took months or years to develop can now emerge within hours. Viral controversies often represent collective shadow projections, sudden, intense eruptions of judgment directed at individuals who have become symbols of denied aspects of cultural psychology. The echo chamber effect of algorithmic content curation further amplifies projection by ensuring that you primarily encounter views that confirm your existing beliefs. This reduces opportunities for the kind of perspective taking that might reveal the projective nature of your judgments about others. Learning to recognize your own projections requires developing what Jung called introspective capacity, the ability to observe your emotional reactions with curiosity rather than immediately acting on them. When you notice strong reactions to other people's behavior, the first question should not be what is wrong with them, but rather what is this reaction teaching me about myself? Jung developed several practical techniques for identifying projections. One involves paying attention to the language you use when criticizing others. Phrases like "people like that always" or "anyone who would" often signal projective thinking. The certainty and generalization suggests that you are responding not to specific behaviors, but to symbolic representations of disowned aspects of your own nature. Another indicator is disproportionate emotional intensity. If your reaction to someone's behavior significantly exceeds what the situation warrants, you are likely encountering projection. The colleague who always interrupts, the friend who never considers your feelings, the politician who obviously has ulterior motives. These absolute judgments usually reveal more about the observer than the observed. Dreams often provide clear pictures of projection dynamics. You may dream of being attacked by figures who represent the very qualities you criticize in waking life. Or you might dream of becoming the kind of person you consciously despise. These dreams invite you to recognize that the external conflicts you experience may actually be internal struggles seeking resolution. Active imagination techniques can help you dialogue directly with projected content. Jung encouraged patients to engage in conversations with the people who irritated them most, not externally, but within the privacy of their own minds. These internal dialogues often reveal that the other person has important information about neglected aspects of your own psychology. The goal is not to stop having reactions to other people. Emotional responses provide valuable information about both yourself and your environment. Rather, the goal is to distinguish between perception and projection, to recognize when your emotional reactions are revealing your own psychological contents rather than simply describing external reality. As projection is recognized and gradually withdrawn, something unexpected often happens. The qualities you discovered through your reactions to others become available for conscious integration. The aggression you projected onto hostile people can be reclaimed as healthy assertiveness. The neediness you criticized in demanding friends can be acknowledged as your own capacity for interdependence. The creativity you envied in impractical artists can be expressed in your own life. This is why Jung considered shadow work essential for psychological wholeness. The shadow contains not only troublesome qualities, but also unrealized potentials. By projecting these potentials onto others, you rob yourself of access to aspects of your nature that could enrich your life significantly. The person who projects their artistic sensitivity onto unrealistic creative types may discover their own capacity for aesthetic appreciation. The individual who projects their leadership abilities onto controlling personalities may find their own capacity for appropriate authority. The one who projects their vulnerability onto weak people may access their own capacity for authentic intimacy. Integration of shadow projections does not mean acting out every impulse or expressing every quality without discrimination. Rather, It means developing conscious relationship with the full spectrum of your psychological potential so that you can choose which aspects to express, in which contexts. This process transforms not only your relationship with yourself, but also your relationships with others. When you are no longer compelled to use other people as screens for your projections, you can see them more clearly and relate to them more authentically. The energy that was previously bound up in projection becomes available for genuine connection and creative expression. Withdrawal of projections is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process that continues throughout life. As you grow and encounter new situations, previously unconscious aspects of your nature may be constellated and subsequently projected onto others. Each new projection offers an opportunity for greater self-knowledge and psychological integration. Jung emphasized that complete elimination of projection is neither possible nor desirable. Some degree of projection is necessary for empathy, imagination, and creative expression. The goal is not to achieve a state of perfect objectivity, but to develop the capacity to recognize when projection is occurring and to use that recognition as information about your own psychological development. The ability to work constructively with projection becomes a form of psychological skill that enhances every area of life. In professional relationships, you can distinguish between legitimate concerns about colleagues' behavior and reactions that reveal your own denied qualities. In friendships, you can recognize when conflicts are actually opportunities for mutual shadow work. In romantic partnerships, you can use projection dynamics as windows into both your own and your partner's unconscious psychology. Most importantly, developing consciousness around projection contributes to what Jung called the collective healing of humanity. Every individual who learns to recognize and integrate their own shadow projections reduces the amount of unconscious material circulating in the collective psyche. In a world torn by conflicts that often represent massive projective identifications, this individual work becomes a form of service to the larger community. When you can look at someone whose behavior triggers intense reactions and ask, what is this person showing me about myself, rather than, how can I fix or avoid this person? You participate in the ancient and ongoing project of making the unconscious conscious. This shift from projection to integration represents nothing less than the evolution of human consciousness itself. There exists a particular quality in certain individuals that you recognize immediately, though you might struggle to name it precisely. They speak with absolute certainty about complex matters. They seem never to doubt their own judgment. When challenged, they do not engage with the substance of disagreement, but instead question the challenger's competence, motives, or understanding. They carry themselves as if they possess access to truth unavailable to ordinary mortals. You have encountered inflation, one of Jung's most important and dangerous psychological concepts. Unlike the neurotic individual who struggles with self-doubt, or the depressed person who cannot access their own agency, the inflated person has solved the problem of uncertainty by identifying with something far greater than their individual ego. They have become, in their own experience, a conduit for absolute truth, cosmic justice, or divine will. the inflated state feels magnificent from within. The ordinary anxieties that plague human existence, self-doubt, moral ambiguity, the fear of making mistakes, simply evaporate. In their place comes a sense of clarity, purpose, and power that can be genuinely intoxicating. The inflated person experiences themselves as having transcended human limitations, as having achieved a state of consciousness unavailable to others. Jung understood that inflation represents a particular form of unconscious possession. But unlike other forms of possession, it is often mistaken for enlightenment or spiritual achievement. The inflated individual genuinely believes they have awakened to truth, discovered universal principles, or been chosen for a special mission. This conviction is not cynical manipulation, but sincere delusion, which makes it both more understandable and more dangerous. Inflation occurs when what Jung called archetypal energy overwhelms the individual ego. Archetypes, those universal patterns of human experience that exist in the collective unconscious, carry enormous psychological power. When they remain in their proper place as guiding images and inspirational forces, they enrich human life immeasurably. But when an archetype seizes control of the ego directly, the result is inflation. Consider the archetype of the wise old man or wise woman, that universal pattern representing wisdom, guidance, and spiritual authority. In healthy psychological functioning, this archetype inspires individuals to develop their own wisdom, to seek knowledge, and to offer guidance when appropriate. But when someone becomes possessed by this archetype, they begin to experience themselves as the embodiment of wisdom itself. The possessed individual no longer seeks to become wise. They believe they have already achieved ultimate wisdom. They no longer learn from others. They see themselves as having transcended the need for instruction. They no longer offer guidance with humility. They pronounce truth with absolute authority. The archetypal energy that should inspire growth instead arrests development by creating the illusion that the journey is complete. Jung observed similar patterns with other archetypes. The hero archetype can inflate someone into believing they are destined to save the world. The mother or father archetype can create individuals who see themselves as cosmic parents responsible for everyone's well-being. The judge archetype can produce people who feel entitled to pronounce moral verdicts on all human behavior. In each case, the individual ego, that small, learning, growing, fallible aspect of personality, becomes identified with energies far too vast for any single person to contain. The result is not genuine power, but a brittle inflation that must constantly defend itself against any evidence of human limitation. Contemporary spiritual and self-help cultures provide particularly fertile ground for inflation. The emphasis on awakening, enlightenment, and transformation can create individuals who believe they have achieved states of consciousness that exempt them from ordinary human constraints. They speak of having evolved beyond jealousy, anger, or fear, not recognizing that these claims represent inflated identification rather than genuine transcendence. Jung called this spiritual materialism, the ego's attempt to possess spiritual achievement the same way it might possess material success. The truly spiritual person becomes humble in the face of mystery. The inflated person claims to have solved it. The authentic seeker continues questioning. The inflated one has all the answers. This dynamic appears in various forms across different spiritual traditions. The meditation practitioner who claims to have achieved permanent enlightenment, the therapy patient who declares themselves healed and begins teaching others, the workshop leader who presents themselves as having transcended human psychology entirely. What makes spiritual inflation particularly dangerous is that it often contains elements of genuine insight. The inflated person may have had authentic spiritual experiences, discovered useful practices, or developed real wisdom about certain aspects of life. But they have confused these partial achievements with total realization, leading them to claim authority far beyond their actual development. The seductive quality of spiritual inflation lies in its promise of escape from the human condition. Rather than accepting the ongoing challenge of growth, learning, and uncertainty, the inflated person can rest in the conviction that they have arrived at final truth. This provides tremendous psychological comfort, but arrests genuine development. Jung lived through the rise of fascism and witnessed how inflation could manifest on a collective scale. He observed that totalitarian movements often attract individuals who are susceptible to archetypal inflation, people who see themselves as instruments of historical destiny, cosmic justice, or divine will. The inflated political leader does not simply advocate for policies, they embody ultimate truth. They do not represent constituents, they channel the will of the people, the nation, or history itself. Opposition to their agenda becomes not just political disagreement, but resistance to cosmic order. In both cases, the inflated individual has lost the capacity for genuine political discourse because they have identified their position with absolute truth. Compromise becomes impossible because it would require acknowledging that their opponents might have legitimate concerns. Dialogue becomes unnecessary because they already possess complete understanding. The followers of inflated leaders often participate in collective inflation, experiencing themselves as part of a movement that embodies ultimate truth or historical necessity. This shared inflation creates the kind of mass psychology that Jung found so terrifying in his observations of Nazi Germany. Contemporary professional culture creates numerous opportunities for ego inflation. The expert who has achieved recognition in their field may begin to believe that their expertise extends to all areas of life. The successful entrepreneur may conclude that their business success proves their superiority as a human being. The academic may become so identified with intellectual achievement that they lose touch with other dimensions of existence. Professional inflation often manifests as an inability to acknowledge the limits of one's knowledge or competence. The inflated professional speaks with authority on subjects outside their expertise, dismisses questions as evidence of others' ignorance, and reacts to challenges as personal attacks rather than opportunities for dialogue. This dynamic is particularly dangerous in fields that involve power over others: medicine, education, politics, and therapy. When professionals become inflated with their own authority, they lose the capacity for the humility that genuine service requires. The inflated doctor becomes contemptuous of patients who question their judgment. The inflated teacher becomes intolerant of students who learn differently. The inflated therapist becomes convinced of their own healing power rather than recognizing their role as a facilitator of their client's own growth. Jung observed that professional inflation often compensates for deep feelings of inadequacy or imposter syndrome. The individual who secretly fears they are not qualified for their role may defend against this anxiety by identifying with an inflated version of professional competence. This creates a brittle confidence that must constantly be defended against any evidence of limitation or error. Inflation is inherently unstable because it represents an identification that exceeds the actual capacity of the individual ego. The small human self cannot indefinitely sustain identification with archetypal energies. Eventually, the inflation must collapse, often in spectacular and destructive ways. Jung documented the predictable stages of inflated collapse. First comes increasing rigidity as the inflated person struggles to maintain their expanded identity. They become less tolerant of questions, more defensive about challenges, and more desperate to find confirmation of their special status. Next appears the phenomenon Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of any psychological extreme to transform into its opposite. The inflated savior may suddenly become convinced they are damned. The inflated wise person may plunge into convinced ignorance. The inflated leader may collapse into complete powerlessness. These dramatic reversals often involve what Jung termed shadow eruptions, the sudden emergence of all the qualities that the inflated identity had to exclude. The saintly guru is caught in sexual scandal. The righteous politician is revealed as corrupt. The perfect parent is exposed as abusive. The collapse of inflation is always traumatic, but it also represents an opportunity for genuine psychological development. When the inflated identity can no longer be maintained, the individual is forced to confront their actual human limitations and begin the work of authentic growth. Jung identified humility as the primary antidote to inflation, but not the false humility that represents inverted grandiosity. True humility emerges from a realistic assessment of both one's gifts and limitation. It includes what he called divine humility, recognition that whatever wisdom, creativity, or power one possesses comes not from the ego, but from sources beyond conscious control. The humble person can acknowledge their achievements without identifying with them completely. They can offer guidance without claiming infallibility. They can exercise authority without losing sight of their own need for guidance. They remain teachable precisely because they do not confuse their current understanding with ultimate truth. Developing genuine humility requires what Jung called active imagination with the transcendent function, the ability to hold awareness of both one's expanded potential and one's current limitations simultaneously. This creates psychological tension, but it is creative tension that promotes continued growth rather than the stagnation of inflated certainty. Practices that cultivate humility include regular acknowledgement of mistakes and limitations, seeking feedback from others, maintaining beginner's mind in areas of expertise, and developing what Jung called a religious attitude toward the unconscious, recognition that consciousness emerges from and depends upon forces beyond ego control. Learning to recognize inflation in others is crucial for protecting yourself from its destructive effects. Inflated individuals can be enormously charismatic and convincing, particularly when they embody archetypes that you find personally compelling. The person who seems to have achieved the spiritual development you seek, the leader who promises to solve the problems that concern you, the teacher who claims to possess the knowledge you need, all can trigger what Jung called archetypal fascination. The warning signs of dangerous inflation include absolute certainty about complex matters, intolerance of questions or challenges, claims to special knowledge or authority, inability to acknowledge mistakes or limitations, and tendency to treat disagreement as evidence of others' inferior development or understanding. Perhaps most importantly, inflated individuals create what Jung called psychological infection. They induce inflation in their followers. If you find yourself beginning to feel that you have special access to truth through your association with someone, that you are part of an enlightened group in opposition to ignorant masses, or that questioning your leader or teacher represents weakness or disloyalty, you may be caught in an inflated system. The antidote is maintaining what Jung called critical participation, the ability to appreciate someone's gifts and learn from their insights while retaining awareness of their human limitations. This requires emotional maturity and psychological strength that many people have not developed, which is why inflated leaders can attract large followings even when their limitations are obvious to outside observers. The goal of working with inflation is not to eliminate all contact with archetypal energies that would impoverish human life significantly. Rather, the goal is to develop what Jung called conscious participation in archetypal patterns while maintaining ego integrity and humility. This might mean allowing yourself to be temporarily possessed by the teacher archetype when offering instruction, while remembering that you are not the teacher incarnate. It could involve channeling the energy of the warrior when defending important principles, while recognizing that you are not engaged in a cosmic battle between good and evil. It might require accessing the healer archetype when helping others, while maintaining awareness that healing comes through you, not from you. This kind of conscious participation requires tremendous psychological sophistication. You must be able to step into expanded roles and identities when appropriate, while maintaining the flexibility to step back into ordinary human consciousness when the situation changes. You must be able to channel archetypal energies for creative or healing purposes, while avoiding identification with them as permanent aspects of your identity. Jung called this capacity active imagination with archetypal contents, the ability to dialogue with archetypal energies rather than being overwhelmed by them. Through such dialogue, you can access the wisdom and power of the archetypes while maintaining your individual perspective and human limitations. The ultimate paradox is that genuine transcendence of inflation comes not through claiming to be more than human, but through fully accepting your humanity. When you can embrace both your extraordinary potential and your ordinary limitations, you create space for archetypal energies to work through you without possessing you. This represents what Jung considered the highest form of psychological development, not the elimination of ego, but its conscious cooperation with transpersonal forces. You are sitting across from someone you have known for years when something unsettling happens. Their posture shifts, their voice changes, and suddenly you feel as though you are speaking not to your friend, but to something ancient and impersonal looking out through their eyes. They begin to speak in pronouncements rather than conversation. Their gestures become theatrical, and their presence fills the room in a way that seems disproportionate to their actual size. You have the eerie sense that your friend has temporarily vacated their own personality, making room for something far older and more powerful to take the stage. This is archetypal possession, one of Jung's most profound and disturbing discoveries about the human psyche. Unlike inflation, where the ego identifies with archetypal energy while maintaining some sense of individual identity, possession involves a more complete takeover. The person becomes a vessel through which universal patterns of human experience express themselves directly, often with little conscious participation from the individual whose personality has been temporarily displaced. Jung understood archetypes as the fundamental building blocks of human psychology, inherited predispositions to respond to certain situations in universally recognizable ways. The mother archetype shapes how we understand nurturing and care. The warrior shapes our responses to conflict and challenge. The trickster influences our relationship with rules and boundaries. The wise old man or woman guides our search for meaning and understanding. Normally, these archetypal patterns operate in the background of consciousness, influencing our perceptions and behaviors in subtle ways. They provide the psychological scaffolding that makes human culture possible, the reason why people across vastly different societies recognize the same basic story patterns, respond to similar symbols, and organize their communities around comparable roles and relationships. But when psychological defenses are weakened through crisis, trauma, extreme stress, or deliberate practices that lower conscious barriers, archetypes can break through into direct expression. The individual personality steps aside, and something much more primitive and powerful takes control of speech, gesture, and behavior. Witnesses to archetypal possession often describe an uncanny quality that is immediately recognizable, yet difficult to articulate precisely. The possessed person speaks with an authority that seems to come from beyond their normal personality. Their words carry a weight and resonance that exceed what you would expect from their usual manner of expression. They may use vocabulary, concepts, or speaking patterns that are foreign to their ordinary conversation. Physical changes accompany the psychological transformation. Posture becomes more pronounced, either rigidly upright or dramatically slouched, depending on which archetypal energy has taken control. Facial expressions become exaggerated, almost mask-like. Hand gestures become broader and more theatrical. The voice may deepen or become more strident. Eye contact becomes either intensely penetrating or studiously avoidant. The possessed individual often displays knowledge or insights that seem to exceed their normal capacities. The mild-mannered accountant becomes an eloquent philosopher when possessed by the wise old man archetype. The shy teenager transforms into a commanding presence when seized by the warrior energy. The practical executive begins speaking in poetic metaphors under the influence of the artist archetype. Most unsettling is the sense that you are no longer dealing with an individual human being, but with a universal principle that has temporarily borrowed human form. The possessed person may speak of themselves in the third person or use the royal we. They may make pronouncements about the nature of reality, the meaning of existence, or the proper ordering of society with absolute conviction. This conviction is not the result of careful reasoning, but emerges from what Jung called archetypal knowledge, the sense that the archetype carries within itself eternal truths that transcend individual experience. The possessed person does not argue for their position. They proclaim it as self-evident truth that others should recognize immediately. Jung identified numerous archetypal patterns, but certain ones appear most frequently in cases of possession. The savior archetype creates individuals who experience themselves as chosen to rescue humanity from its suffering or ignorance. They develop messianic complexes, gather followers, and proclaim revolutionary doctrines that will transform the world. The possessed person becomes utterly convinced of their special mission and may sacrifice everything, family, career, financial security, in service of their calling. The judge archetype possesses individuals who feel compelled to pronounce moral verdicts on everyone around them. They become arbiters of right and wrong, cataloguing the sins of others with relentless precision. Their speech becomes filled with absolute moral categories, good and evil, pure and corrupt, righteous and damned. They often develop elaborate philosophical or theological systems that justify their harsh judgments. The victim archetype takes control of people who organize their entire identity around their suffering. They become professional victims, collecting injustices and displaying their wounds as credentials. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to demonstrate how they have been wronged, misunderstood, or betrayed. They may develop powerful charisma around their suffering, attracting others who are drawn to rescue or comfort them. The warrior archetype possesses individuals who see themselves engaged in cosmic battles between opposing forces. Everything becomes a conflict between good and evil, truth and falsehood, order and chaos. They develop militant worldviews and may become involved in ideological movements that promise ultimate victory over designated enemies. Their language becomes filled with military metaphors and calls to battle. The lover archetype can possess someone completely, making them identify entirely with romantic or sexual energy. They become intoxicated with passion, convinced that their current relationship represents ultimate love, or that their sexual desires transcend ordinary human limitations. They may abandon all other responsibilities in pursuit of romantic fulfillment or sexual expression. The magician archetype creates individuals who believe they possess special powers to manipulate reality through will, ritual, or secret knowledge. They may develop elaborate occult practices, claim supernatural abilities, or present themselves as having access to hidden dimensions of existence. They often attract followers who are seeking miraculous solutions to life's problems. While individual possession is dramatic enough, Jung reserved his deepest concerns for collective archetypal possession situations where entire groups become seized by the same archetypal energy. He witnessed this phenomenon firsthand during the rise of fascism in Germany, where millions of people became possessed simultaneously by archetypal patterns of tribal belonging, heroic destiny, and apocalyptic transformation. Collective possession begins when shared stress, uncertainty, or crisis creates openings in the psychological defenses of a population. Economic depression, military defeat, social upheaval, or natural disasters can weaken the rational ego defenses that normally keep archetypal energies in check. When an entire community becomes vulnerable simultaneously, the stage is set for mass possession. A charismatic individual who is already possessed by a particular archetype can serve as a catalyst for collective possession. Their personal conviction and archetypal authority can activate similar patterns in others who are psychologically vulnerable. Like a tuning fork that causes other instruments to vibrate at the same frequency, the possessed leader can induce possession in their audience. Jung observed that collective possession often involves what he called archetypal complementarity. Different segments of the population become possessed by different but related archetypes that together form a complete mythological system. Some become saviors, others become warriors in service of the mission. Still others become judges who identify enemies of the cause, and many become followers who surrender individual will to the collective purpose. The result is a social movement that operates more like a myth being enacted than a rational political process. Ordinary democratic discourse becomes impossible because the possessed group experiences opposition not as legitimate disagreement, but as cosmic evil that must be defeated. Compromise becomes betrayal of sacred mission. Questioning becomes heresy against absolute truth. Jung identified several factors that increase susceptibility to archetypal possession. Individuals with weak ego development, those who have never fully differentiated themselves from family, community, or cultural expectations, remain more vulnerable to being overwhelmed by archetypal energies. Without a strong sense of individual identity, they lack the psychological resources to maintain boundaries between personal consciousness and transpersonal forces. People who have experienced significant trauma may also be more susceptible to possession. Trauma can fracture the ego's normal defensive structures, creating gaps through which archetypal energies can enter. The trauma survivor may unconsciously seek healing through identification with powerful archetypal patterns that promise to restore their sense of agency and meaning. Extreme life transitions, midlife crisis, spiritual emergence, loss of major life roles can temporarily destabilize ego defenses and create openings for possession. The middle-aged executive who suddenly abandons career and family to become a spiritual teacher may be experiencing possession by the wise old man archetype. The recent widow who becomes a militant advocate for social causes may be channeling the warrior archetype as a way of managing her grief and powerlessness. Ironically, individuals with genuine spiritual gifts or creative talents may be particularly vulnerable to possession by the very archetypes that represent their areas of strength. The naturally intuitive person may become possessed by the prophet archetype. The artistically gifted individual may be seized by the artist archetype. The psychologically insightful person may fall under the control of the healer archetype. This occurs because these individuals have authentic connections to archetypal energies through their gifts, but they may lack the ego's strength to maintain conscious partnership with these forces rather than being overwhelmed by them. Their genuine abilities make them convincing when possessed, which can attract followers and reinforce the possession. One of the most disturbing aspects of archetypal possession is its contagious quality. Possessed individuals often develop magnetic charisma that can induce altered states in others. Their absolute conviction, combined with the archetypal authority they channel, can bypass the critical thinking of people who might otherwise be quite rational and skeptical. Jung called this phenomenon psychological infection and observed it operating in various contexts: religious revivals, political rallies, therapeutic communities, and spiritual movements. The possessed leader creates an emotional field that activates archetypal patterns in their audience. People who attend such gatherings often report feeling swept away by energies beyond their control. Social media and digital communication technologies have amplified the contagious potential of possession. Possessed individuals can now broadcast their archetypal conviction to vast audiences simultaneously. The comment sections of controversial posts become laboratories for studying how possession spreads through virtual communities. People who have never met in person can become collectively possessed by shared archetypal patterns activated through digital interaction. The echo chamber effect of algorithmic content curation further accelerates possession contagion by ensuring that possessed individuals primarily encounter others who share their archetypal identification. This creates virtual communities organized around possession states rather than rational discourse or shared interests. Learning to recognize archetypal possession both in yourself and others represents crucial psychological self-defense in a world where such phenomena are increasingly common. The warning signs include sudden, dramatic personality changes, claims to special knowledge or authority, absolute moral certainty, intolerance of questions or challenges, and the development of grandiose mission statements or worldviews. Perhaps most importantly, possessed individuals create what Jung called participation mystique. They induce others to suspend critical thinking and join in their archetypal identification. If you find yourself feeling unusually drawn to someone's message despite reservations about their claims, if you notice yourself beginning to adopt their language patterns or worldview without careful consideration, if you feel pressure to demonstrate loyalty through unquestioning acceptance, you may be encountering possession and beginning to be affected by it yourself. Protection requires maintaining what Jung called conscious participation in archetypal energies while avoiding identification with them. This means recognizing when you are being influenced by archetypal patterns, whether through your own direct experience or through contact with possessed individuals, and maintaining enough ego strength to engage with these energies without being overwhelmed by them. Practical protections include maintaining diverse sources of information and perspective, regularly questioning your own certainties, seeking feedback from people who do not share your worldview, and cultivating what Jung called the transcendent function. The ability to hold opposing viewpoints in consciousness simultaneously without immediately resolving the tension. The goal of working with archetypal possession is not to eliminate all contact with archetypal energies. That would impoverish human experience dramatically. Rather, the goal is to develop conscious relationship with these powerful psychological forces so that they can enrich life without controlling it. Jung advocated what he called active imagination with archetypal contents, deliberately engaging with archetypal energies through fantasy, art, writing, or ritual while maintaining ego consciousness throughout the process. This allows you to access the wisdom and creativity that archetypes offer without losing yourself in possession states. When you feel archetypal energies beginning to activate, whether through crisis, creative inspiration, spiritual experience, or social pressure, the key is to maintain what Jung called the observing ego. Part of your consciousness participates in the archetypal experience, while another part witnesses and contextualizes what is happening. This might mean allowing yourself to feel the power of the warrior archetype when defending important principles, while remembering that not every disagreement is a cosmic battle. It could involve channeling the energy of the lover when experiencing deep intimacy, while maintaining awareness that your partner is a human being rather than a divine figure. It might require accessing the healer archetype when helping others, while recognizing the limits of your actual abilities and knowledge. Such conscious participation requires considerable psychological development and ongoing practice. But it offers the possibility of accessing archetypal wisdom and power without losing individual agency or becoming a vehicle for unconscious forces. In Jung's vision, this represents the ultimate goal of psychological individuation, not the elimination of transpersonal influences, but their conscious integration into a life that remains authentically human while being enriched by contact with the eternal, patterns that shape all human existence. You find yourself, once again, in a relationship that feels eerily familiar. The details are different. New person, new setting, new circumstances, but the emotional landscape is identical to places you have been before. The same arguments emerge with predictable regularity. The same power dynamics establish themselves despite your conscious intentions. The same disappointments unfold with such precision that you begin to wonder if you are living the same story repeatedly, with only the names and faces changed. This recognition, half déjà vu, half nightmare, marks your encounter with what Jung called the compulsion to repeat. It represents one of the most profound and troubling aspects of unconscious psychology. The tendency for unresolved psychological contents to recreate themselves endlessly in external circumstances until consciousness finally intervenes to break the cycle. The compulsion to repeat operates according to principles that Jung discovered through decades of clinical observation. What has not been made conscious will be lived out unconsciously, often in destructive patterns that seem to have a life of their own. The psyche possesses an uncanny ability to orchestrate external events that mirror internal psychological configurations, drawing to itself precisely the people and circumstances that will activate unresolved complexes and conflict. Jung understood this phenomenon as evidence of what he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest a deep connection between psychological and physical reality. But where positive synchronicity can guide and inspire, negative synchronicity traps individuals in repetitive cycles that recreate familiar suffering without leading to resolution or growth. The process begins in early life when traumatic or overwhelming experiences create what Jung called psychological complexes, autonomous clusters of thoughts, feelings, and memories that operate outside conscious control. These complexes form around core wounds: abandonment, betrayal, humiliation, powerlessness, rejection. They represent the psyche's attempt to organize and contain traumatic material. But they also become internal magnets that attract similar experiences throughout life. A child who experiences parental abandonment develops a complex around themes of attachment and loss. This complex does not remain passive, but actively influences perception, decision-making, and behavior in ways designed to recreate familiar emotional territory. The adult may unconsciously choose partners who are emotionally unavailable, interpret normal relationship challenges as signs of impending abandonment, or behave in ways that push others away while simultaneously desperately trying to hold on to them. The tragic irony is that these patterns often begin as survival strategies. The child learns to anticipate abandonment as a way of protecting against its devastating surprise. But what serves as protection in childhood becomes a prison in adulthood, creating the very experiences it originally sought to avoid. Jung observed that complexes possess their own intelligence and intentionality. They can override conscious will, influence perception to selectively notice evidence that confirms their worldview, and orchestrate elaborate scenarios that recreate their core themes. The abandonment complex becomes a master puppeteer, arranging circumstances that will inevitably lead to abandonment experiences that prove its basic assumptions about the world. One of the most disturbing aspects of repetition compulsion is the way it makes familiar suffering feel more comfortable than unfamiliar joy. Individuals caught in repetitive patterns often sabotage positive experiences that do not match their internal psychological templates. The person accustomed to chaotic relationships may feel bored or anxious in stable partnership. The individual whose identity is organized around struggle may unconsciously undermine their own success. This occurs because psychological complexes create what Jung called emotional homeostasis, an unconscious preference for familiar emotional states, regardless of whether they are pleasant or painful. The psyche resists change, even positive change, because it threatens the established order of internal psychological organization. Research in contemporary neuroscience confirms Jung's clinical observation. Traumatic experiences create neural patterns that become self-reinforcing through repetitive activation. The brain literally wires itself to expect certain kinds of experiences and may interpret neutral or positive events as threats to its established patterns of response. The repetition compulsion operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. At the perceptual level, complexes influence attention and interpretation, causing individuals to notice and emphasize aspects of reality that confirm their expectations while filtering out contradictory information. At the behavioral level, complexes influence choices and actions in ways that recreate familiar scenarios. At the interpersonal level, complexes attract and repel certain types of people, creating relationships that activate complementary psychological patterns in others. Perhaps nowhere is the compulsion to repeat more evident than in family systems, where psychological patterns are passed from generation to generation with remarkable fidelity. Jung observed that children unconsciously absorb not only their parents' conscious values and behaviors, but also their unresolved psychological contents. What the parent cannot face in themselves becomes the child's inheritance. The mother who cannot acknowledge her own neediness may raise children who become compulsively self-sufficient. The father who never processed his own authority conflicts may create sons and daughters who struggle with power dynamics throughout their lives. The parents who maintain their marriage by avoiding conflict may produce children who either become conflict avoidant themselves or swing to the opposite extreme of creating drama and confrontation. These transmissions occur through subtle emotional communications that bypass conscious awareness. Children are extraordinarily sensitive to unconscious parental material and often organize their developing personalities around managing or compensating for their parents' psychological blind spots. They may become the family scapegoat, carrying projections of unwanted qualities, or the family hero, embodying idealized aspects that distract from underlying dysfunction. The tragic result is that each generation inherits not only genetic material, but psychological material from their predecessors. Patterns of depression, anxiety, addiction, relationship dysfunction, and trauma responses can be passed down through families for generations without anyone recognizing the transmission or developing the consciousness necessary to interrupt it. Jung called this phenomenon the ancestral psyche, the way that unresolved psychological contents from previous generations continue to influence current experience. Breaking free from intergenerational patterns requires not only individual healing, but also what he called ancestral work, the conscious recognition and integration of inherited psychological material. Repetition compulsion extends beyond intimate relationships to influence career patterns, social dynamics, and life choices. Individuals may find themselves repeatedly attracted to work environments that recreate familiar but dysfunctional dynamics from their families of origin. The child of an alcoholic parent may gravitate toward high-stress careers that provide the same kind of chaos and drama they learned to navigate in childhood. Professional relationships often become theaters for the reenactment of early psychological dramas. The person who struggled with authoritarian parents may find themselves in constant conflict with supervisors and managers. The individual who experienced sibling rivalry may unconsciously create competitive dynamics with colleagues. The one who felt invisible in their family may choose careers that either guarantee continued invisibility or demand constant attention and recognition. Social and political affiliations can also be influenced by repetition compulsion. People may be drawn to ideological movements that recreate the emotional dynamics of their early family experience. The person who grew up in a family organized around crisis and external threat may be attracted to political movements that emphasize danger and the need for protection. The individual whose family maintained cohesion through shared enemies may gravitate toward ideologies that define themselves in opposition to designated outgroups. These patterns are particularly troubling because they operate largely outside conscious awareness while influencing choices that seem rational and voluntary. The person believes they are choosing careers, relationships, and affiliations based on their values and preferences. not recognizing the extent to which these choices are determined by unconscious psychological forces seeking familiar emotional territory. Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest connections between psychological and physical reality, provides insight into how repetition compulsion operates in the external world. Individuals caught in repetitive patterns often experience uncanny coincidences that seem to conspire to recreate familiar experiences. The person struggling with abandonment issues may repeatedly encounter partners who seem ideal initially, but inevitably reveal themselves to be emotionally unavailable. The individual with authority conflicts may find themselves working for a succession of bosses who exhibit similar dysfunctional management styles. The one whose family communicated through crisis may discover that peaceful periods in their adult life are invariably interrupted by dramatic emergencies. From a rational perspective, these patterns seem to represent either incredible bad luck or unconscious self-sabotage. Jung suggested a more complex explanation, that psychological complexes create what he called fields of attraction that draw corresponding external circumstances. The unconscious psyche, in its drive to complete unfinished psychological business, orchestrates encounters with people and situations that will activate unresolved material. This is not mystical thinking, but recognition of the subtle ways that unconscious psychology influences perception, choice, and behavior. The person with abandonment issues may unconsciously select partners with avoidant attachment styles, interpret normal relationship challenges as signs of rejection, or behave in ways that trigger their partner's own psychological defenses. What appears to be synchronicity may actually be the unconscious mind's sophisticated ability to recreate familiar psychological configurations through seemingly random external events. The first step in interrupting repetition compulsion is recognition, developing the capacity to notice patterns as they emerge rather than being swept along unconsciously by their momentum. This requires what Jung called the observing ego, a part of consciousness that can witness psychological processes without being completely identified with them. Recognition often begins with the uncomfortable realization that this has happened before. The emotional signature of repetitive patterns is unmistakable once you learn to recognize it. The sense of déjà vu, the feeling of being trapped in a familiar story, the recognition that despite changed circumstances, the underlying dynamics remain identical. But recognition alone is insufficient to break repetitive cycles. Jung emphasized that complexes possess autonomous energy that can override conscious intention. Simply knowing that you are repeating a pattern does not automatically provide the power to choose differently. Integration requires what he called active imagination, deliberate engagement with the psychological contents that drive repetitive behavior. This might involve dialoguing with the internal figures that represent different aspects of the complex. The adult who keeps recreating childhood abandonment might engage in conversation with the wounded child within who is desperately trying to control others' behavior to prevent loss. Through such dialogue, the adult consciousness can understand the child's fears while also recognizing that the child's strategies, however well-intentioned, are creating the very outcomes they seek to avoid. Integration also requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to experience conflicting psychological forces without immediately resolving them through action. The person caught in repetitive relationship patterns must learn to tolerate the anxiety of not knowing how a relationship will unfold without resorting to familiar control strategies that sabotage intimacy. This process is neither quick nor comfortable. Jung warned that breaking repetitive patterns often involves a period he called creative illness, a time of psychological disorganization during which old patterns lose their power, but new ones have not yet crystallized. During this transitional period, individuals may feel lost, anxious, or depressed as they learn to navigate life without the familiar compass of their repetitive patterns. Repetition compulsion operates not only in individual psychology, but also in collective human behavior. Societies, cultures, and nations repeat historical patterns with remarkable consistency, often recreating the same conflicts, power dynamics, and tragedies across generations. Jung observed this phenomenon in his analysis of the rise of fascism in Germany, noting how unresolved collective trauma from World War I contributed to the psychological conditions that made the Nazi movement possible. Historical repetition often follows predictable cycles. Economic boom and bust, political swings between authoritarianism and democracy, social movements that begin with idealistic goals but devolve into rigid orthodoxies, all represent collective versions of individual repetition compulsion. What societies cannot consciously integrate, they are condemned to repeat. The mechanisms are similar to individual repetition, but amplified through mass psychology. Collective traumas create what Jung called cultural complexes, autonomous psychological contents that influence entire populations. These complexes can remain dormant for generations before being activated by circumstances that resemble the original traumatic condition. The American cultural complex around racial violence, the German complex around authority and submission, the British complex around imperial identity, all represent collective psychological contents that continue to influence contemporary events despite conscious efforts to move beyond historical patterns. Breaking these collective repetitions requires the same kind of consciousness and integration work that individuals must undertake, but applied to entire societies. Dreams provide unique insight into repetition compulsion because they often present the underlying psychological patterns in symbolic form, stripped of the distracting details that obscure repetitive cycles in waking life. Individuals caught in repetitive patterns frequently report having similar dreams, repeatedly being chased by the same figure, finding themselves in identical anxiety-provoking situations, or encountering the same symbolic scenarios with minor variations. These repetitive dreams represent the unconscious mind's attempt to process and resolve the psychological contents that drive compulsive behavior. The dream ego often makes different choices than the waking ego, experimenting with alternative responses to familiar challenges. Pay attention to how you behave in repetitive dreams. Do you run from the pursuing figure or turn to face it? Do you remain passive in threatening situations or assert yourself? These dream behaviors may suggest possibilities for breaking repetitive patterns in waking life. Jung encourages patients to engage in active imagination with their repetitive dream figures, entering into dialogue with the characters and symbols that appeared repeatedly. Often these figures represented aspects of the psyche that had been split off and were seeking integration. The pursuing figure in dreams might represent rejected aspects of the self. The threatening authority might symbolize internalized parental voices that continue to control adult behavior. Working with repetitive dreams can provide a laboratory for experimenting with new responses to old patterns. Through lucid dreaming or active imagination techniques, individuals can practice different ways of engaging with the psychological contents that drive compulsive behavior. These practice sessions in the imaginal realm can then transfer to increased flexibility and choice in waking life. Contemporary therapeutic culture, despite its emphasis on healing and growth, can sometimes perpetuate repetition compulsion in subtle ways. The focus on processing trauma, exploring childhood wounds, and understanding psychological patterns can become an end in itself rather than a means toward integration and transformation. Some individuals become what Jung called professional patients, people who organize their identity around their psychological wounds and the ongoing process of healing them. They may spend decades in various forms of therapy, accumulating insights about their patterns without ever developing the capacity to choose differently. The therapeutic process itself becomes a repetitive pattern that provides the illusion of progress while maintaining the underlying psychological status quo. Jung warned against what he called psychological materialism, the tendency to collect psychological insights and techniques the same way others collect material possessions. True healing, he insisted, requires not just understanding repetitive patterns, but developing the courage to live differently despite the anxiety and uncertainty that change inevitably brings. The therapeutic relationship can also become a site for repetition compulsion, when therapists unconsciously collude with their clients' patterns rather than challenging them. The therapist who needs to be needed may enable clients' dependence. The one who identifies with the rescuer role may prevent clients from developing their own agency. The therapist who has not resolved their own authority issues may either become authoritarian or abdicate appropriate therapeutic authority. The ultimate goal of working with repetition compulsion is not to eliminate all patterns. Human life necessarily involves recurring themes and cyclical experiences. Rather, the goal is to transform unconscious repetition into conscious choice. This means developing the capacity to recognize when old patterns are being activated and choosing whether to engage with them or respond differently. Conscious choice requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold awareness of multiple possibilities simultaneously without being compelled to act on any of them immediately. When you can feel the familiar emotional pull of a repetitive pattern while also maintaining awareness of alternative responses, you create space for genuine choice. This development often involves accepting what Jung called the burden of consciousness, the recognition that with awareness comes responsibility. Once you understand your repetitive patterns, you can no longer claim ignorance as an excuse for unconscious behavior. This increased responsibility can feel overwhelming, but it also represents the possibility of authentic freedom. The process of integration is typically gradual and requires ongoing practice. Old patterns may reassert themselves during times of stress, fatigue, or emotional activation. The goal is not perfection, but increasing flexibility and consciousness in your responses to life's challenges. Each time you recognize a pattern and choose differently, you weaken its autonomous power and strengthen your capacity for authentic choice. There comes a moment in many lives, often around midlife, sometimes earlier, occasionally much later, when the structures that once provided meaning begin to feel insufficient. The career that once energized becomes routine. The relationships that once satisfied feel constraining. The beliefs that once offered certainty seem hollow. This experience, which Jung called the confrontation with the unlived life, marks the beginning of what may be the most important psychological journey any individual can undertake, the process of individuation. Individuation is Jung's term for the lifelong process of psychological development through which an individual becomes who they truly are, rather than who they have been conditioned to be. It involves the integration of conscious and unconscious contents, the reconciliation of opposing psychological forces, and the development of what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness, that represents the potential for psychological completeness that exists within every human being. This journey is neither comfortable nor optional for those who feel its call. Jung described it as a divine discontent, an inner pressure that makes continued unconsciousness impossible. The individuating person can no longer tolerate living a borrowed life, wearing masks that no longer fit, or suppressing aspects of their nature that demand expression. They are compelled by psychological necessity to undertake the difficult work of becoming authentic. The process typically begins with what Jung called the breakdown of the persona, the recognition that the social roles and identities you have constructed no longer adequately contain your psychological reality. This breakdown can be triggered by external events, divorce, job loss, illness, death of loved ones, or by internal pressure as unconscious contents demand attention. Either way, the comfortable illusion of having life figured out dissolves, leaving the individual face to face with fundamental questions about identity, meaning, and purpose. Jung identified several predictable stages in the individuation process, though he emphasized that this journey is deeply individual and cannot be reduced to a simple formula. The first stage involves the confrontation with the shadow, the recognition and integration of the denied, rejected, and repressed aspects of personality that have been pushed into the unconscious. This confrontation is often precipitated by the failure of projection. The qualities you have spent years criticizing in others suddenly become impossible to deny in yourself. The anger you projected onto hostile people emerges in your own behavior. The neediness you despised in dependent individuals reveals itself in your own relationships. The creativity you envied in impractical artists demands expression in your own life. The shadow confrontation is typically the most difficult stage of individuation because it requires admitting that you are not who you thought you were. The carefully constructed self-image that has provided security and social acceptability must expand to include qualities that challenge your preferred identity. This process can trigger what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of depression, anxiety, or existential crisis as the ego struggles to accommodate previously rejected material. But the shadow contains not only negative qualities. Jung emphasized that what he called the golden shadow, unrealized positive potentials that were discouraged by family or culture, also requires integration. The person who was taught to suppress their leadership abilities must reclaim their capacity for authority. The one who learned to hide their sensitivity must acknowledge their emotional intelligence. The individual who was discouraged from creative expression must find ways to honor their artistic nature. The second major stage involves the encounter with the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of the psyche that represents qualities typically associated with the opposite gender. For men, the anima represents receptivity, emotion, intuition, and relatedness. For women, the animus represents assertion, logic, focused thinking, and independence. These contrasexual figures often appear first in projections onto romantic partners or idealized figures who seem to embody everything that feels missing from one's own personality. The man falls in love with a woman who seems to possess all the emotional wisdom he lacks. The woman becomes fascinated with men who appear to have the confident authority she was never allowed to develop. Integration of the anima or animus requires withdrawing these projections and developing the corresponding qualities within oneself. This does not mean that men should become feminine or women masculine in conventional terms, but rather that all individuals need access to the full range of human psychological capacities, regardless of their gender identity. The third stage involves the confrontation with archetypal inflation, learning to relate consciously to the transpersonal energies that seek expression through individual personality without being overwhelmed or possessed by them. The individuating person may find themselves temporarily identified with archetypal figures, the wise old man or woman, the great mother or father, the hero or heroine, as they explore aspects of their nature that transcend ordinary personality. The challenge is to benefit from archetypal energies without losing individual perspective. Jung called this conscious participation in archetypal patterns, the ability to channel transpersonal forces for creative or healing purposes while maintaining ego integrity and humility. Dreams play a crucial role in the individuation process because they provide direct communication from the unconscious about the psychological work that needs to be done. Jung observed that the dreams of individuating people often follow predictable patterns that correspond to the stages of psychological development. Early in the process, dreams frequently feature shadow figures, same-sex characters, who embody qualities the dreamer has rejected or failed to develop. These shadow dreams serve as invitations to recognize and integrate denied aspects of personality. The mild-mannered person dreams of violent criminals. The responsible adult dreams of irresponsible rebels. The rational thinker dreams of emotional, intuitive figures. As the shadow work progresses, dreams often begin featuring contrasexual figures, anima or animus images, that represent the need to develop complementary psychological qualities. Men may dream of wise women who offer emotional guidance. Women may dream of strong masculine figures who model appropriate assertion or focused thinking. Later stages of individuation are often marked by what Jung called archetypal dreams, images that seem to come from the deepest layers of the collective unconscious and deal with universal themes of death and rebirth, sacred marriage, divine child, cosmic order. These dreams suggest that the individual has made contact with the self, the archetype of wholeness that represents their unique potential for psychological completeness. Jung encouraged people to work actively with their dreams through techniques like amplification, exploring the cultural and mythological associations of dream symbols, active imagination, continuing the dream through conscious fantasy, and artistic expression, drawing, painting, or writing about dream imagery. Contemporary culture's emphasis on individualism can create confusion about what Jung meant by individuation. The modern focus on self-actualization, personal fulfillment, and following your dreams often represents what Jung would have called ego inflation rather than authentic individuation. True individuation is not about becoming more individualistic, but about becoming more complete, integrating not only personal psychological contents, but also transpersonal archetypal energies that connect the individual to the larger patterns of human existence. Jung emphasized that individuation serves not only the individual, but also the collective. The person who becomes whole contributes to what he called the healing of the collective psyche. They no longer project their shadows onto others, reducing the amount of unconscious material circulating in group dynamics. They develop the capacity for what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, which enables them to remain conscious and grounded during collective crises when others may be swept away by mass psychology. However, Jung also warned about what he called the loneliness of individuation. The process of becoming authentic often requires disappointing family and social expectations, leaving familiar communities that no longer fit, and accepting that many people may not understand or approve of your choices. The individuating person may experience periods of isolation as they outgrow old relationships, while new ones based on authentic connections slowly develop. Central to Jung's understanding of individuation is the principle of holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to contain contradictory psychological forces without immediately resolving them through one-sided identification. Rather than choosing between thinking and feeling, strength and vulnerability, independence and dependence, the individuating person learns to access both poles as situations require. This capacity develops through what Jung called the transcendent function, a psychological process that emerges when conscious and unconscious contents are held in creative tension. Instead of the ego simply choosing one side of a psychological conflict, a third option emerges that transcends the original opposition while incorporating elements of both sides. For example, the person torn between desires for independence and intimacy may discover ways of being authentically themselves within close relationships. The individual struggling between spiritual and material concerns may find approaches to earning a living that also serve deeper values. The one caught between different cultural identities may create new ways of being that honor multiple heritage streams. This integration of opposites is not compromise settling for less of each pole to avoid conflict. Rather, it represents what Jung called the both, and rather than either or approach to psychological wholeness. The individuated person becomes what he termed a coincidentia oppositorum, a living synthesis of opposites that demonstrates the possibility of transcending binary thinking. Jung insisted that genuine individuation cannot be separated from service to the collective. The person who becomes psychologically whole naturally contributes to the healing of their community, family, and culture. This happens not through preaching or teaching, but through embodying the possibility of conscious living. The individuated person becomes what Jung called a container for the collective shadow, someone who can remain conscious and grounded when others are possessed by unconscious forces. During times of collective crisis, war, or mass hysteria, such individuals serve as stabilizing influences who can think clearly and act ethically when others are swept away by archetypal possession. This service to the collective often requires what Jung called the courage of consciousness, the willingness to stand apart from group consensus when it is based on unconscious identification rather than authentic discernment. The individuated person may find themselves called to speak unpopular truths, challenge collective illusions, or maintain values that others have abandoned under pressure. However, Jung distinguished between healthy individuation and neurotic isolation. The truly individuated person remains connected to their community while maintaining psychological independence. They can participate in collective activities without losing their individual perspective or compromising their authentic values. Jung observed that individuation typically involves significant suffering, not masochistic self-punishment, but the inevitable pain that accompanies psychological growth. He called this meaningful suffering as distinguished from neurotic suffering that serves no developmental purpose. The suffering of individuation comes from several sources. There is the pain of recognizing how much of your life has been unconscious, how many opportunities for authentic living have been missed. There is the grief of outgrowing relationships, communities, and identities that once felt essential. There is the anxiety of living without the certainties that unconsciousness provides. Most difficult is what Jung called the sacrifice of the ego, the recognition that the conscious personality you have constructed, however sophisticated, represents only a small fraction of your total psychological potential. Individuation requires what he termed ego death and rebirth, the dissolution of limited self-concepts to make room for larger identity that includes previously unconscious contents. This sacrificial process cannot be rushed or avoided through positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. Jung insisted that consciousness is always purchased through suffering, the willingness to face difficult truths about yourself and your world, rather than maintaining comfortable illusions. However, he distinguished between neurotic suffering that goes in circles and developmental suffering that leads to growth. The key difference is consciousness, the ability to recognize suffering as information about necessary psychological work rather than simply as something to be eliminated or escaped. The ultimate goal of individuation is not ego strengthening, but what Jung called the realization of the self, the archetype of wholeness that represents each person's unique potential for psychological completeness. The self is not another ego, but a transpersonal organizing principle that coordinates all aspects of personality into a coherent whole. Jung described the self as the God image in the psyche, not in a literal religious sense, but as the psychological equivalent of the divine, that which is most essential, creative, and life-giving within human nature. The self represents what you are in potential rather than what you have become through conditioning and circumstance. The realization of the self typically occurs gradually through what Jung called circumambulation, a spiraling process of return to core psychological themes with increasing depth and integration. The individuating person may revisit the same issues repeatedly, but each time with greater consciousness and capacity for creative response. Signs of self-realization include what Jung called centeredness, a sense of being rooted in something deeper than ego preferences or social expectation. The self-realized person exhibits what he termed authentic authority or leadership that comes not from inflation or identification with archetypal power, but from genuine wisdom and integration. Such individuals often develop what Jung called symbolic attitude, the ability to perceive meaning and pattern in seemingly random events, to recognize the sacred within ordinary experience, to understand their personal story as part of larger mythic patterns that connect them to the eternal dimensions of human existence. Jung emphasized that individuation is not a goal to be achieved, but a lifelong process of continuous development. Even highly individuated people continue to encounter new aspects of their unconscious, face fresh challenges to their integration, and discover previously unknown potentials within themselves. The process is cyclical rather than linear, periods of expansion and growth, alternate with times of consolidation and deepening. Crises that once seemed like setbacks may later be recognized as essential phases in the spiral of development. The individuating person learns to trust the process even when its direction is unclear. Perhaps most importantly, Jung taught that individuation is ultimately a religious process, not necessarily in the sense of organized religion, but as what he called the experience of the numinous. The individuating person increasingly recognizes their life as part of something larger and more meaningful than personal preferences and social expectations. This religious dimension of individuation does not require belief in specific doctrines, but emerges naturally from the experience of psychological wholeness. The person who has integrated their shadows, developed their contrasexual nature, and established conscious relationship with archetypal energies naturally experiences what Jung called the sacred dimension of ordinary life. The individuated person becomes what Jung termed a bridge between worlds, someone who can move between different levels of psychological reality while maintaining their essential humanity. They serve as living demonstrations that psychological wholeness is possible and that the ancient promise of becoming fully human remains available to those willing to undertake the journey toward authenticity and integration. You have traveled far into the hidden territories of the psyche through the theater of personas and the projections of shadow, past the dangerous territories of inflation and archetypal possession, beyond the repetitive loops that trap unconscious souls, toward the possibility of true individuation and wholeness. Now, as all great journeys must, this exploration curves back toward its beginning. But you return changed, carrying with you maps of inner landscapes that were once unmappable darkness. This return is not simply an ending, but a transformation of understanding. The same psychological phenomena that appeared threatening or bewildering when first encountered now reveal themselves as natural, even necessary, aspects of human development. What seemed like pathology may now be recognized as the psyche's intelligence attempting to restore balance, seek integration, or initiate growth through the only means available to it. The persona, which initially appeared as mere social deception, now reveals itself as a sophisticated psychological tool that allows complex inner life to interface with collective demands. The shadow, once seen only as repository of evil impulses, emerges as guardian of unrealized potential and source of creative energy. The inflated ego, no longer simply ridiculous or dangerous, becomes recognizable as the psyche's attempt, however misguided, to contact archetypal sources of meaning and power. Even archetypal possession and repetition compulsion, the most disturbing phenomena we have explored, reveal themselves upon deeper examination as expressions of the fundamental human drive toward wholeness and completion. The possessed individual may be unconsciously seeking contact with transpersonal dimensions of experience. The person trapped in repetitive patterns may be following the psyche's insistence that unfinished psychological business must be resolved before genuine development can proceed. Jung often used alchemical metaphors to describe the process of psychological transformation. And these images illuminate the journey you have undertaken through this exploration. The ancient alchemists believed they could transform base metals into gold through a series of carefully orchestrated procedures involving dissolution, separation, purification, and recombination of elements. Psychological individuation follows a similar pattern. The comfortable but limiting structures of unconscious personality must be dissolved through confrontation with shadow material. The conflicting elements of psyche must be separated and examined individually, persona distinguished from authentic self, projection differentiated from perception, inflation separated from genuine authority. These elements must then be purified through conscious understanding and finally recombined into new configurations that allow for greater wholeness and freedom. What the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, corresponds to the psychological necessity of moving against the natural tendency toward unconsciousness, repetition, and stagnation. Consciousness requires effort. Integration demands courage. Individuation asks for sacrifices that the ego would prefer not to make. But the alchemical metaphor also suggests that this difficult work leads to something genuinely precious, not literal gold, but what Jung called the philosopher's stone of psychological wholeness. The individuated person has access to resources and capacities that remain unavailable to those who have never undertaken the journey through their own depths. One of the most profound shifts that occurs through deep psychological work is the development of what Jung called paradoxical thinking, the ability to hold seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously without immediately resolving them into false simplicity. This capacity emerges naturally from encountering the fundamental paradoxes that characterize all psychological phenomena. The persona is both authentic self-expression and social construction. The shadow contains both destructive impulses and unrealized creative potential. Inflation represents both dangerous possession and contact with genuine transpersonal energies. Projection involves both distortion of external reality and accurate perception of internal psychological contents. Rather than choosing one side of these paradoxes and dismissing the other, mature consciousness learns to appreciate the dynamic tension between opposites as a source of psychological vitality. The individuated person becomes what Jung called a living symbol of the union of opposites, someone who demonstrates through their existence that apparent contradictions can be integrated into larger patterns of meaning, wholeness. This capacity for paradoxical thinking has profound implications for how you engage with others who are at different stages of psychological development. Rather than dismissing the person caught in projection as simply deluded, you can recognize both the distortion in their perception and the valid psychological contents that are seeking expression through the projection. Rather than condemning the inflated individual as merely grandiose, you can acknowledge both their dangerous unconsciousness and their authentic contact with archetypal energies. Perhaps the most significant transformation that occurs through understanding Jung's psychology is the development of what might be called compassionate recognition, the ability to see in others psychological difficulties, reflections of universal human challenges rather than evidence of personal failing or moral weakness. When you recognize your own capacity for projection, inflation, and unconscious repetition, you naturally develop greater tolerance for these phenomena when they appear in others. The person who has wrestled with their own shadow projections cannot maintain self-righteous judgment of others who are struggling with similar dynamics. The individual who has experienced archetypal possession becomes more understanding of those who are currently overwhelmed by transpersonal forces. This compassionate recognition does not mean becoming naive or failing to protect yourself from others' unconscious behavior. Understanding the mechanisms of projection does not require you to accept others' projections as accurate descriptions of your character. Recognizing archetypal possession does not mean surrendering your critical thinking to possessed individuals who claim special authority. Rather, compassionate recognition allows you to respond to others' unconscious behavior from a place of understanding rather than reactive defensiveness. You can set appropriate boundaries while maintaining awareness that their psychological difficulties represent universal human challenges rather than personal moral failures. With understanding comes responsibility. Once you recognize the mechanisms through which unconscious psychological contents influence perception, behavior, and relationship, you can no longer claim innocence about your own participation in psychological dynamics. The person who understands projection bears responsibility for recognizing and withdrawing their own projection. The individual who understands inflation must work to maintain humility and appropriate human scale. Jung called this the burden of consciousness, the recognition that awareness brings with it ethical obligations that cannot be avoided once understanding has been achieved. You become responsible not only for your conscious intentions, but also for the unconscious effects of your psychological processes on others. This responsibility extends beyond individual behavior to collective participation. The person who understands the mechanisms of mass possession and collective projection bears some responsibility for maintaining consciousness during times of collective crisis. When entire communities become swept up in archetypal possession or engaged in massive projective identification, those who remain conscious serve crucial functions as stabilizing influences and witnesses to alternative possibilities. However, Jung also warned against what he called the inflation of consciousness, the tendency for people who have developed psychological understanding to become contemptuous of those who remain unconscious. True psychological maturity includes humility about the ongoing nature of development and recognition that consciousness itself can become a source of unconscious superiority. The ultimate fruit of psychological development is not the elimination of unconscious processes, but their conscious integration into a life that remains fully human while being enriched by contact with transpersonal dimensions of existence. The individuated person does not transcend psychology, but lives it more consciously and creatively. Such individuals develop what Jung called synthetic thinking, the capacity to perceive patterns and connections that transcend ordinary categories of analysis. They can recognize how apparently separate psychological phenomena are actually different expressions of underlying archetypal patterns. They can see how individual psychological difficulties reflect collective cultural dynamics. They can perceive how personal development serves not only individual fulfillment, but also collective healing. This synthetic capacity allows for what Jung termed the transcendent function, the emergence of creative solutions that honor multiple psychological needs simultaneously. Rather than choosing between competing psychological forces, the individuated person can often find approaches that integrate apparent opposites into new forms of living that transcend the original conflicts. Even as psychological understanding deepens, Jung insisted that the psyche retains its essential mystery. Consciousness can illumine previously dark territories, but it cannot eliminate the fundamental unknowability that characterizes psychological life. Dreams continue to bring unexpected contents. Synchronicities continue to reveal meaningful connections that transcend rational explanation. Archetypal energies continue to activate in ways that surprise and humble even the most psychologically sophisticated individual. This ongoing mystery is not a limitation to be overcome, but a source of vitality and meaning that keeps life from becoming mechanistic or predictable. The individuated person develops what Jung called a religious attitude toward the unconscious, not worship of unconscious contents, but respectful recognition of the psyche's creative intelligence and autonomous wisdom. This religious attitude includes what Jung termed symbolic consciousness, the ability to perceive meaning and pattern in apparently random events, to recognize the sacred within ordinary experience, to understand personal story as participation in larger mythic narratives that connect individual existence to eternal dimensions of human experience. As this exploration draws to its close, you find yourself returned to questions that have haunted humanity across cultures and centuries. Who am I beyond the masks I wear? What forces shape my behavior below the threshold of conscious awareness? How can I live authentically in a world that rewards conformity? What does it mean to become fully human? Jung's psychology does not provide final answers to these questions, but offers sophisticated tools for engaging with them consciously and creatively throughout life. The concepts you have explored, persona and shadow, projection and inflation, possession and repetition, individuation and integration, serve as compass points for navigating the complex territories of inner experience. But these concepts remain alive only to the extent that they illuminate your actual experience, rather than becoming rigid intellectual categories. Jung insisted that all psychological theories, including his own, must be held lightly and discarded when they no longer serve the cause of greater consciousness and authentic living. You began this journey seeking perhaps nothing more than a quiet voice to accompany you toward rest. What you have encountered is an invitation to depth that extends far beyond any single evening's listening. Jung's psychology represents not merely one approach among many, but a fundamental recognition that human life contains dimensions of meaning and mystery that reward lifelong exploration. The choice now before you is whether to treat this exploration as interesting information that can be filed away, or as living knowledge that calls for ongoing engagement. The concepts you have encountered are not museum pieces to be admired, but tools for the ongoing work of becoming conscious, authentic, and whole. This work cannot be completed through reading or listening alone, but requires the kind of sustained self-examination that Jung called the confrontation with oneself. It asks you to notice your own projections as they arise, to recognize your personal susceptibility to inflation and possession, to identify the repetitive patterns that structure your relationships and choices. Most challengingly, it invites you to undertake the lifelong journey of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you have been conditioned to be. This journey offers no guarantees of comfort or conventional success, but it provides something that Jung considered far more valuable: the possibility of living a life that is genuinely your own. Perhaps the most radical aspect of Jung's vision is its suggestion that authentic psychological development represents a form of quiet revolution, not against external political systems, but against the unconsciousness that makes all forms of oppression possible. When individuals learn to recognize and withdraw their projections, they undermine the psychological mechanisms that enable scapegoating and persecution. When people develop immunity to archetypal possession, they become resistant to the mass psychology that fuels totalitarian movements. The person who has undertaken serious shadow work naturally becomes more tolerant of human complexity and ambiguity. The individual who has experienced the process of individuation develops what Jung called the courage of consciousness, the ability to think and act independently even under collective pressure to conform. In this sense, psychological development becomes a form of service to the collective human future. Every person who becomes more conscious reduces the amount of unconscious psychological material circulating in human communities. Every individual who learns to relate creatively to archetypal energies contributes to the collective capacity for wisdom rather than possession. Jung believed that the survival and development of human civilization depends upon the emergence of sufficient numbers of individuated people, those who have developed enough consciousness to remain grounded during collective crises and creative enough to generate new solutions to apparently intractable problems. And so we return to the quiet that began this exploration. But it is a different quiet now, not the absence of psychological activity, but the presence of consciousness capable of containing whatever arises without being overwhelmed by it. This is the silence of depth rather than emptiness, of integration rather than avoidance. In this quiet, the various psychological phenomena you have explored continue their eternal dance. Personas shift and adapt to changing circumstances, while authentic selfhood remains aware of their constructed nature. Shadows continue to press for recognition and integration, while consciousness develops greater capacity for acknowledging and channeling their energy creatively. Archetypal forces continue to constellation in individual and collective life, but increasingly they encounter consciousness capable of participating in their energies without being possessed by them. Repetitive patterns may still emerge, but they meet awareness that can recognize them as invitations to integration rather than unconscious fate. This is the paradox of psychological development. The more deeply you understand the mechanisms of unconsciousness, the more respect you develop for consciousness. The more clearly you see the ways that psychological forces can control human behavior, the more precious becomes the freedom that awareness makes possible. As you settle now into whatever form of rest awaits you, carry with you not the burden of becoming perfect, but the invitation to become whole. Let the voice of this exploration fade into the larger silence that contains all voices, all stories, all human attempts to understand the mystery of consciousness encountering itself in form. In dreams and waking, in solitude and relationship, in times of crisis and periods of peace, the invitation remains constant: to see more clearly, to love more deeply, to choose more consciously, to become more fully yourself while serving the larger patterns of meaning that connect all human existence. This is Jung's gift to those willing to receive it. Not answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but more conscious uncertainty. Not the elimination of suffering, but the transformation of meaningless pain into meaningful growth. Rest now in the quiet that contains all psychological activity without being disturbed by it. And know that when you wake, the invitation to depth will be waiting, as patient and persistent as consciousness itself.